Welcome back to Intro to Philosophy 1010. So this is now the fourth fundamental question in the final week of our class, and I'm realizing just how difficult it really would be for everyone to read every reading thoroughly and do the journals and do the discussion forums and the exams, and I'm still grading at this point. I'm making this video on Thursday evening, June 28th. I'm still grading discussion forum 2. I've got to grade exams 2, journal 4. Tomorrow you'll be handing in your exam 3s. So it's such an accelerated class to really condense this whole semester into 6 weeks. I've taught it before in the summer in the class, and it would be twice a week for 2 hours and 40 minutes. And that worked better because everyone was forced to sit there and concentrate for a limited amount of time. But I'm just getting the feeling in this summer class it might be hard to pull these all together. So I know that the discussion forum 3 is going to be due on the initial post on Tuesday, and you'll need to compare Nietzsche's idea of slave morality and master morality from his essay Beyond Good and Evil, or the section of it that we're going to read of his book Beyond Good and Evil. You're going to compare that to Grace Clement's comments on the concepts of the ethic of care and the ethic of justice in her article, which is the last reading of the whole book, The Ideal Types of Care and Justice by Grace Clement. That's the discussion forum. So to help you guys get ready for that initial post, I'm going to switch the order of discussion, of part 4 of our book, and start with Nietzsche, Friedrich Nietzsche. The first professor I had, you would say Nietzsche. I've asked German-speaking people, and I've had different answers, but I think the consensus is Nietzsche, Friedrich Nietzsche. I'm going to start with the section from his book, Beyond Good and Evil, so you'll have a good understanding of master morality and slave morality, and then the next video will be Grace Clement, and then I'll go back to the beginning of part 4 of the book with the Bhagavad Gita, and then work chronologically up through there. So discussion question 1 I think is a good place to start, and I'll explain throughout this video about Nietzsche. So I'm not an expert on all of these philosophers, but I have read all of Nietzsche's books, so I've got a pretty good grasp of the game he's playing. And in this kind of an introductory class, it's just not feasible for me to really get into the guts of his book. He's one of those writers, I think, very rare, like Plato was the same way, where there's different levels of meaning, and they're using art to explain things that might not be expressible through words. I think most people just write what they think, and it's just a straightforward communication of their ideas, but not with Nietzsche, as he'll confess himself in sections of this book that we're going to read. And also with Plato, he's notoriously elusive. He writes in a dialogue form. You can't really say that Plato said anything. You have to say, well, Plato wrote a dialogue in which he depicted Socrates saying this or that. But does that necessarily mean that was Plato's opinion? Not necessarily. It seems like it is, but is it? Or, it's an open question. For me, I think he generally did believe what Socrates said, but Socrates was himself always ironic. So what did Socrates really mean? So I'm introducing you to these kinds of basic ideas in the history of Western philosophy and Eastern philosophy, which is why I love this book. But the readings from Eastern philosophy we've seen, I don't think any of them were being intentionally deceptive, whereas I know Nietzsche says that's what he's doing. So when you confess to lying and wearing a mask and being deceptive in your book, then it would seem prudent to not take anything at face value that the writer says. But for the purpose of this class and for the discussion forum 3 questions, you're going to know, all you need to know is the basic concepts that he comes up with about master morality and slave morality. The games he twists and plays with them, I will briefly talk about, but a straightforward understanding is all you'll need. And then you'll compare that to the ethic of care and the ethic of justice, which I'll talk about in the next video, or you can read that. That article's easier to understand than not Plato, Nietzsche's Beyond Good and Evil. So, master morality, slave morality, he first brings up those two terms on page 549 on the first full paragraph, about a quarter of the way down the page. He says, in a tour through the many finer and coarser moralities which have hitherto prevailed or still prevail on the earth. So he's a historian. He was a philologist by training, studied ancient languages and how they developed. So in his many readings of classical literature from many civilizations, he says, I found certain traits recurring regularly together and connected with one another until finally two primary types revealed themselves to me, and a radical distinction was brought to light. There is master morality and slave morality. I would at once add, however, that in all higher and mixed civilizations there are also attempts at the reconciliation of the two moralities, but one finds still oftener the confusion and mutual misunderstanding of them, indeed sometimes their close juxtaposition, even in the same man, within one soul. So when he says, I would add at once, however, that's the monkey wrench in the system here. In all higher civilizations, there's an attempt to reconcile these two separate moralities. And if you read the way he describes these two different and polar opposite moralities, you'll notice that even within one page, the way he describes one as opposed to the other starts to flip around, so that he'll describe master morality the way he previously described slave morality, and vice versa, and that they roll into each other. And I think that is one of the games he's playing, and he gives little hints, such as here, in all higher mixed civilizations, there's attempts to reconcile them, but they're more often confused and misunderstood. So my reading of this book is that Nietzsche unannouncedly confuses and mixes up these moralities, although he's aware of what he's doing, and that the goal is to reconcile the two. But, well then why would he play this game and be so deceptive? Well, you can get a kind of an inkling of why he might want to do that if you now skip to the end of this book. So this is the final section of Beyond Good and Evil, and this is where he talks about the god Dionysus. So page 563, about halfway down the page, the last paragraph. So I'm going to just read through here. This is his, it's a strange thing. He presents himself as an atheist throughout the book, and yet here he is praising his god Dionysus. And the way he describes this god is a union of slave morality and master morality. And the god lies for a reason, to expose people's innermost motivations to themselves so that they'll become wealthier in self-knowledge. And Nietzsche, by praising master morality over slave morality, in one sense, I think he's trying to draw out the tyrant in people, like an emetic. He gives somebody a medicine that makes them vomit out some kind of a poison. In some respects, it seems he was doing something like that, because it was an extreme reaction to what he saw as the forthcoming slave morality overthrow of all of the older traditions in Europe at the time, such as, for example, Christianity. Nietzsche's most famous for his phrase, God is dead. So it's not that he would depict Christianity as slave morality. And yet here he is, after saying things like God is dead, talking about his god Dionysus, and now I'll just read, and you'll see how he's This is one long sentence that we start out with a lot of dashes and semicolons. So he says, the genius of the heart, as that great mysterious one possesses it, the tempter god and born rat catcher of consciences, whose voice can descend into the netherworld of every soul, who neither speaks a word nor casts a glance in which there may not be some motive or touch of allurement, to whose perfection it pertains that he knows how to appear, not as he is, but in a guise which acts as an additional constraint on his followers to press ever closer to him. So this God wears a disguise, and he's a rat catcher of consciences. To follow him, and the fact that he does wear a disguise and plays tricks on people is attractive to his followers, who follow him more cordially and thoroughly. The genius of the heart, which imposes silence and attention on everything loud and self-conceited, which smooths rough souls and makes them taste a new longing, to lie placid as a mirror, that the deep heavens may be reflected in them. The genius of the heart, which teaches the clumsy and too hasty hand to hesitate and to grasp more delicately, which scents the hidden and forgotten treasure, the drop of goodness and sweet spirituality under thick dark ice, and is a divining rod for every grain of gold long buried and imprisoned in mud and sand. The genius of the heart, from contact with which everyone goes away richer, not favored or surprised, not as though gratified and oppressed by the good things of others, but richer in himself, newer than before, broken up, blown open, and sounded by a thawing wind. More uncertain, perhaps, more delicate, more fragile, more bruised, but full of hopes which as yet lack names, full of a new will and current, full of a new ill will and countercurrent. But what am I doing, my friends? Of whom am I talking to you? Have I forgotten myself so far that I have not even told you his name? Unless it be that you have already divined of your own accord who this questionable God and Spirit is that wishes to be praised in such a manner. For as it happens to everyone who from childhood onward has always been on his legs, and in foreign lands I have also encountered on my path many strange and dangerous spirits, above all, however, and again the one of whom I have just spoken, in fact, no less a personage than the god Dionysus, the great equivocator and tempter, to whom, as you know, I once offered in all secrecy and reverence my first fruits, the last, as it seems to me, who has offered a sacrifice to him, for I have found no one who could understand what I was then doing. So, I'll stop there. This equivocator and tempter god Dionysus, this genius of the heart, who descends to the depths of people's souls and breaks them open to expose the hidden gold specks in the mud and the murk. He knows how to disguise himself so to relate with people in such a way as to induce this upcoming of their souls. It's a strange thing for someone who's so famous for being an atheist to be praising this God and the genius of the heart, which just seems out of place. And this God likes to wear disguises. Let me just read, if you look on page 562, right across the page from the beginning of the genius of the heart, the Dionysus description, Nietzsche says here, every philosophy also conceals a philosophy. Every opinion also a lurking place. Every word is also a mask. This is just one of the different places where he talks about the need to wear a mask, especially if you're a recluse like he claims to be. The Beyond Good and Evil is constructed in a series of aphorisms. It's not one continuous essay. It's numbered paragraphs or multiple paragraphs with one self-contained theme, and then they lead into each other. So if you look at the bottom of page 559, I'm just going to give you this taste of how he's claiming to always be wearing a mask, and then as I begin to describe master morality and slave morality, you'll see how that's a contradiction of what master morality is supposed to be. So the bottom of page 559, it's a little dialogue between two people, one of whom finds another suffering. So, wanderer, who art thou? I see follow thy path without scorn, without love, with unfathomable eyes, wet and sad as a plummet which has returned to the light insatiated out of every depth. What did it seek down there? With a bosom that never sighs, with lips that conceal their loathing, with a hand which only slowly grasps, who art thou? What hast thou done? Rest thee here, this place has hospitality for everyone. Refresh thyself. And whoever thou art, what is it that now pleases thee? What will serve to refresh thee? Only name it, whatever I have I offer thee. To refresh me? To refresh me? O thou prying one, what sayest thou? But give me, I pray thee, what? Speak out. Another mask, a second mask. All right, so when you read something like that with this poor traveler who's been to the bottom of life and whose eyes reflect the sadness of a plummet, of a waterfall that plummets underwater and then after a long time rolling around underwater finally comes up to the light. What did you see down there? The only thing that can heal this wanderer after having that vision is another mask. So says Nietzsche. So when he's continuously talking about how recluses like himself require masks and their philosophy itself is just a mask, then you have to realize that it's not the safest bet to take what they say at face value. Nevertheless, for this very basic introductory class to philosophy, you can take at least what he says about master morality and slave morality at face value when you're comparing it to Grace Clement. So, I've read that first description of the two moralities on page 549, and where he says, you know, in higher civilizations, there's an attempt at a reconciliation of the two, but more often they're confused with each other. And then he'll go on to describe them, the two different moralities, and they get switched and morphed into each other as he does so. But the basic idea, which I'll just describe without reading sections, and then I'll go back and read a couple, is that masters are strong and proud, and they conquer other people, not with a bad conscience about it, but with an instinctive feeling that that's just the natural way. Because they are expressions of what Nietzsche calls the will to power, which is for him the fundamental motivating principle and substance of the universe. Everything is made out of the will to power. His philosophy of the will to power is similar to the Taoist philosophy or the Hindu philosophy of Brahman, this underlying force from which the material world emerges. Even though he's most often understood as an atheist, he's not a materialist. He doesn't think things can be reduced to little unthinking atoms. He thinks those little unthinking atoms are themselves manifestations of this will to power, a living force of the cosmos. And this living force expresses itself as master morality and as slave morality. That's why the more comprehensive person would try to reconcile the two. Although the way Nietzsche describes it, it implies that it's the masters who embrace master morality who are purer expressions of the will to power. But let me just read now some, and then the slave morals are the opposite of master morality. What the masters call good, the slaves call evil. What is strong and domineering and conquers and sees everything around itself as something to be utilized except for other people in their own group. That's an important distinction, which will become especially important when we compare the Beyond Good and Evil to Grace Clement. So I'm going to continue reading here on page 549. The distinctions of moral values have either originated in a ruling caste, pleasantly conscious of being different from the ruled, or among the ruled class, the slaves and dependents of all sorts. In the first case, when it is the rulers who determine the conception good, it is the exalted, proud disposition which is regarded as the distinguishing feature, and that which determines the order of rank. The noble type of man separates himself from the beings in whom the opposite of this is exalted, proud disposition displays itself. He despises them. All right, so those who aren't proud and exalted, the masters despise those people. Let it at once be noted that in the first kind of morality, the antithesis good and bad means practically the same as noble and despicable. The antithesis good and evil is of a different origin. The cowardly, the timid, the insignificant, and those thinking merely of narrow utility are despised. Moreover, also, the distrustful, with their constrained glances, the self-abasing, the dog-like kind of men who let themselves be abused, the mendicant flatterers, and above all the liars, it is a fundamental belief of all aristocrats that the common people are untruthful. We truthful ones, the nobility in ancient Greece called themselves. It is obvious that everywhere the designations of moral value were at first applied to men and were only derivatively and at a later period applied to actions. It is a gross mistake, therefore, when historians of morals start with questions like, why have sympathetic actions been praised? The noble type of man regards himself as a determiner of values. He does not require to be approved of. He passes the judgment. What is injurious to me is injurious in itself. He knows that it is he himself only who confers honor on things. He is a creator of values. He honors whatever he recognizes in himself. Such morality equals self-glorification. I'll go back to the rest of that paragraph when we get to the discussion questions. But the slave morality, he starts to discuss that on page 550, about 3/4 of the way down the page. He says, it is otherwise with the second type of morality, slave morality, supposing that the abused, the oppressed, the suffering, the unemancipated, the wary, and those uncertain of themselves should moralize. What will be the common element in their moral estimates? Probably a pessimistic suspicion with regard to the entire situation of man will find expression, perhaps a condemnation of man together with his situation. The slave has an unfavorable eye for the virtues of the powerful. He has a skepticism and distrust, a refinement of distrust of everything good that is there honored. He would fain persuade himself that the very happiness there is not genuine. On the other hand, those qualities which serve to alleviate the existence of sufferers are brought into prominence and flooded with light. It is here that sympathy, the kind, helping hand, the warm heart, patience, diligence, humility, and friendliness attain to honor, for here these are the most useful qualities and almost the only means of supporting the burden of existence. Slave morality is essentially the morality of utility. I'm going to skip the next sentence. Then he says, according to slave morality, therefore, the evil man arouses fear. According to master morality, it is precisely the good man who arouses fear and seeks to arouse it, while the bad man is regarded as the despicable being. The contrast attains its maximum when, in accordance with the logical consequences of slave morality, a shade of depreciation, it may be slight and well-intentioned, at last attaches itself to the good man of this morality, because, according to the servile mode of thought, the good man must in any case be the safe man. He is good-natured, easily deceived, perhaps a little stupid. Everywhere that slave morality gains the ascendancy, language shows a tendency to approximate the significations of the words good and stupid. A last fundamental difference, the desire for freedom, the instinct for happiness, and the refinements of the feeling of liberty belong as necessarily to slave morals as morality as artifice and enthusiasm in revenge and devotion are the regular symptoms of an aristocratic mode of thinking and estimating. So, that's just the basic breakdown of the difference between master morality and slave morality. So from page 549 to page 551, you'll find the basic idea. And then he elaborates on those two. And as I've said, as he goes on to elaborate on them, the way he describes one becomes the way he describes the other. And I'm hesitant to start drawing out those comparisons because it's such a subtle untwining of his writing that I think it goes a little bit beyond the nature of an introductory class. But let me at least do a couple of examples. For example, on page 549, after he describes, I read about already this master morality. They despise the slaves and above all the liars. It says that on about 3/4 of the way down on page 549. It is a fundamental belief of all aristocrats that the common people are untruthful. We truthful ones, the nobility in ancient Greece called themselves. So if you are considering yourself to be proud and strong, you don't need to lie. First of all, why would you do something that you'd be ashamed of? And if you did, why would you be so cowardly as to lie about it? So, according to this first initial description of master morality, the masters hate the liars. And yet we saw that Nietzsche is always praising the need or the use of wearing masks, which is a lie. And the way he describes his god, Dionysus, who's the supreme master, it's a deceiver. He's a tempter god, an equivocator. He wears masks. He presents himself not as he is, but as he needs to be perceived by the people whose hearts he's trying to touch. So, right there, you can start to see, it's very unlikely that Nietzsche, who's such a powerful mind, didn't notice these contradictions. So the implication is they are intentional. That's just one most basic example. The way he talks about the top of page 551, slave morality is essentially the morality of utility. Well, then by the bottom of page 551, when he's talking about master morality, that masters don't believe that vanity is even a real thing because they can't understand how someone could be so self-debasing as to gauge their own worth on the opinions of others. But he'll talk about how, okay, you might be interested in the way others perceive you for the usefulness that it has for you. Well, that is a slave characteristic. To be thinking about the utility of things is the way slaves behave. It's just continuously. If you read it, you'll see how the way he describes, initially the masters have a greater respect for age and tradition, whereas the slaves are always looking for the promises of the future. Why? Because the past is the province of the masters, so the slaves are hoping the future will be a world where the masters aren't in control anymore. Nietzsche would say that would be the same as hoping that you could have life without any organic functioning. Why? Because it's all a byproduct of the will to power. And I'll read that introductory part of this book in a little bit, but to return to this way that Nietzsche's flipping master morality and slave morality, he talks about later that slave morality is actually the most ancient instinct and that master morality is a newer invention. So I think I'm just going to go to discussion question 2, and then as I see some of these flipping games that he's playing, describing the discussion question, I'll point them out. But on page 567, discussion question 2, Nietzsche mentions happiness in a few of these paragraphs. What does Nietzsche's view explain? So there's a different kind of happiness. There's the master morality happiness, and there's the slave morality happiness. The first time he describes happiness is very early in this section, and I think I will read it because he gets into his idea of the will to power. If you look on page 548, about a third of the way down the page, in the middle of that paragraph, he says, the essential thing, however, in a good and healthy aristocracy is that it should not regard itself as a function either of the kingship or the commonwealth, but as the significance and highest justification thereof. That it should therefore accept with a good conscience the sacrifice of a legion of individuals who, for its sake, must be suppressed and reduced to imperfect men, to slaves and instruments. Its fundamental belief must be precisely that society is not allowed to exist for its own sake, but only as a foundation and scaffolding by means of which a select class of beings may be able to elevate themselves to their higher duties and in general to a higher existence Like those sun-seeking climbing plants in Java, they are called Sippomatador, which encircle an oak so long and so often with their arms until at last, high above it but supported by it, they can unfold their tops in the open light and exhibit their happiness. So there's the happiness of a master, successfully suppressing the slave class like a creeping vine enfolds a tree so as to open its blossom high above the rest of the world. And why do they enjoy that? Because they are the incarnate will to power. Let me just read this next paragraph because it's pretty powerful commentary. He knows how radical and seemingly cold-hearted it sounds when he's describing this and praising master morality. So let me just continue here. The bottom paragraph on page 548. To refrain mutually from injury. All right, and this part is going to be important for the comparison with Grace Clement, because Nietzsche talks about the masters have this tenderness for each other. In their own circle, among those whom they perceive to be equal, they exhibit all of the virtues that the slave morality says all humans should exhibit to everyone. The masters reserve that kind of tenderness for their own sphere, their own people, and with the rest of the world they treat as they feel necessary for their own happiness. And what is their own happiness? Just being able to elevate themselves higher and higher. So I'll just read this bottom paragraph. To refrain mutually from injury, from violence, from exploitation, and put one's will on a par with that of others, this may result in a certain rough sense in good conduct among individuals when the necessary conditions are given, namely the actual similarity of the individuals in amount of force and degree of worth, and their correlation within one organization. As soon, however, as one wished to make this principle more generally, it is possible even, and if possible, even as the fundamental principle of society, it would immediately disclose what it really is, namely a will to the denial of life, a principle of disillusion and decay. That's what he's saying slave morality is. Here one must think profoundly to the very basis and resist all sentimental weakness. Life itself is essentially appropriation, injury, conquest of the strange and weak, suppression, severity, obtrusion of peculiar forms, incorporation, and at the least, putting it mildly, exploitation. But why should one forever use precisely these words on which for ages a disparaging purpose has been stamped? Even the organization within which, as was previously supposed, the individuals treat each other as equal, it takes place in every healthy aristocracy, must itself, if it be a living and not a dying organization, do all that towards other bodies which the individuals within it refrain from doing to each other. It will have to be the incarnated will to power. It will endeavor to grow, to gain ground, attract to itself, and acquire ascendancy, not owing to any morality or immorality, but because it lives, and because life is precisely will to power. So, will to power is the essence of life, and the nature of the will to power is to incorporate things to make itself more powerful. And then Nietzsche goes on to describe master morality and slave morality, and he says, I'll point this out again, it's such an important addition to his concept. I would at once add, however, that in all higher and mixed civilizations there are also attempts at the reconciliation of the two moralities. So, for the will to power to overcome something, it has to overpower itself. It has to absorb itself. So, master morality and slave morality, they're both initially radiating from the underlying will to power, which is the essence of life itself. Later, he'll describe, and I've already read it, his god Dionysus. Dionysus is the incarnated will to power, and in Dionysus we see that there is a reconciliation of master morality and slave morality. The discussion question number 2 on page 567, Nietzsche mentions happiness in a few of these paragraphs. So we went over this, the happiness of the Java plant that's high above the trees, like the happiness of an aristocracy that has successfully wound itself around the lower classes so that it can express its excellence. Nietzsche would say all great works of science and art and literature emerged from an aristocracy, and they couldn't have done that without relying on a slave class to do the work of the beasts of burdens so that they could reserve their energy for higher tasks. And Nietzsche says that's just the nature of life. As hard as it is, that's nature. And to think that it could ever be otherwise is to deny the essence of life itself. That's what Nietzsche says, at least on the surface. I think that is true, but then the opposite of that is also true. And that that's just my theory, but I think it's not, once I've said it, I think if you read through even just this small section of Beyond Good and Evil, it will at least seem plausible. All right, but happiness is also the undoing of the master morality. At the bottom of page 552, so he says a species, and when he says a species here, he's talking about a certain, an aristocracy, like the aristocracy of a Greek polis. He's using the word species to describe that. So a species originates and a type becomes established and strong in the long struggle with essentially constant, unfavorable conditions. On the other hand, it is known by the experience of breeders that species which receive superabundant nourishment and in general a surplus of protection and care immediately tend in the most marked way to develop variations and are fertile in prodigies and monstrosities, also in monstrous vices. Now look at an aristocratic commonwealth, say an ancient Greek polis or Venice, as a voluntary or involuntary contrivance for the purpose of rearing human beings. There are there men beside one another, thrown upon their own resources, who want to make their species prevail, chiefly because they must prevail or else run the terrible danger of being exterminated. The favor, the superabundance, the protection are there lacking, under which variations are fostered. The species needs itself as species, as something which, precisely by virtue of its hardness, its uniformity, and simplicity of structure, can in general prevail and make itself permanent in constant struggle with its neighbors, or with rebellious and rebellion-threatening vassals. The most varied experience teaches it what are the qualities to which it principally owes the fact that it still exists, in spite of all gods and men, and has hitherto been victorious. These qualities it calls virtues, and these virtues alone it develops to maturity. It does so with severity, indeed it desires severity. Every aristocratic morality is intolerant in the education of youth, in the control of women, in the marriage customs, in the relations of old and young, in the penal laws, which have an eye only for the degenerating. It counts intolerance itself among the virtues under the name of justice. A type with few but very marked features, a species of severe, warlike, wisely silent, reserved, and reticent men, and as such with the most delicate sensibility for the charm and nuances of society, is thus established. Unaffected by the vicissitudes of generations, the constant struggle with uniform unfavorable conditions is, as already remarked, the cause of a type becoming stable and hard. Finally, however, a happy state of things results. The enormous tension is relaxed. There are perhaps no more enemies among the neighboring peoples, and the means of life, even of the enjoyment of life, are present in superabundance. With one stroke, the bond and constraint of the old discipline severs. It is no longer regarded as necessary, as a condition of existence. So then, what he'll say then occurs is that the aristocracy will then degenerate they'll flicker out in brilliant fireworks of wit and depravity, he says up at the top of page 548. But notice that happiness, a happy state of things, marks the death of an aristocracy and the beginning of the victory of slave morality. So those were 2 pages where he talked about happiness. One was the happiness of finally conquering and successfully suppressing the lower classes so as to allow the blossoms of your aristocratic civilization to bloom. But then there's the happiness of okay, once you've reached that point and there's no longer any external threats, the degeneration sets in, because that constant unfavorable condition no longer necessitates that severity and self-discipline that were required to build the aristocracy to begin with. Nietzsche will also say the very desire for happiness is itself a symptom of slave morality, because slaves are miserable. They're being oppressed by the masters. They seek that which they don't have. And so it's a symptom. On page 551, about a quarter way down the page, he says, "A last fundamental difference, the desire for freedom, the instinct for happiness, and the refinements of the feeling of liberty belong as necessarily to slave morals and morality as artifice and enthusiasm and revenge and devotion are the regular symptoms of an aristocratic mode of thinking." So I've given you a few examples of Nietzsche's different interpretations of happiness. So for the masters, the healthy kind of happiness is where they have this high tension that demands self-discipline, the alternative being extinction. And when they pull themselves together and simplify their code of conduct in a way that will become victorious, then they're happy. But the negative kind of happiness it results from when they've actually achieved everything that they've tried to conquer, and there's no longer any obstacles to overcome, no threats. That leads to this just kind of a prodigal happiness where they become degenerate. Then the next generation will become, the aristocracy will flicker out with wit and depravity, was one of the images that he used. All right, on page 568, discussion question 3, how do the ideas of Amor, fati, and eternal recurrence from the part 2 Nietzsche selection fit in with the ideas in the selection here? So we read just 3 paragraphs from the gay science in part 2 of this book. So that the Amor fati, love of fate. It was New Year's Day. Nietzsche said, from now on, I will look at the necessary as the beautiful. Anything that I see around me, I will interpret, well, that happened, it was therefore necessary. Necessity is beautiful. I will therefore beautify the world by affirming it. And the idea of the eternal recurrence, he said, oh, imagine if some dwarf crept up on your shoulder and whispered in your ear, everything will return again and again in the same way as it has happened before, and in the exact same sequence, even this moonbeam through these trees and this spider, down to the finest detail, all of existence repeats itself eternally. How does this selection about master morality and slave morality fit in with that? Well, one thing you could say is Nietzsche expresses disgust at the forthcoming tsunami of slave morality that he sees overwhelming Europe. You know, he wrote this in the 1880s, and it was democracy that he saw was going to be the prevailing government system, and the slave morality that accompanies democracy would destroy the aristocracy and lead to this mediocre, nauseating slave morality of the happy, stupid man, kind of like the Homer Simpson society. And this was, he thought, something that was such a nauseating fear for the future that it caused higher men, he calls them, to become recluses and just not want to eat from the same trough as the rest of people in society. So how does that very negative picture of the future for Nietzsche fit in with his other ideas of amor fati and eternal recurrence? Well, you should look at it, okay, if that's really what you see is happening, you should still see it as necessary and beautiful. It's going to come back and be master morality again and slave morality again and again and again anyway, so you might as well see it as a beautiful, eternally recurring pattern. There's one interpretation. You can draw any interpretations that you want. All I really grade on is knowledge of the text. So if I see that you've read the text, you've thought about it, and then you've compared them, that's the primary requirement. Discussion question 4, I am going to answer when I go back and cover Immanuel Kant, the reading from Kant in section 4 of our book. Because it says, what are the main differences between Nietzsche's approach and the ones seen in the selections from Kant and Mill? Explain. Well, we're not reading Mill. It's already been eliminated because we can't read every single reading. So we will be reading Kant, and when I go through the Kant reading in that video, at the end of those discussion questions, I'll answer this discussion question. But my main purpose for getting this video out is so you have something to work with for the discussion forum, the initial post of which is due on Tuesday. All right, so that I think is enough for Beyond Good and Evil. The next video will be about Grace Clement, and we'll go over her analysis of the concepts of the ethic of care and the ethic of justice. She's a lot more straightforward, so it won't be as difficult to understand. And then after that, as I said at the beginning of this video, I'll go back to the beginning of section 4 of our book, beginning with the Bhagavad Gita.